It is well known that slavery was a major issue in the United States since the very founding of this country, but what exactly progressively put it to a stop? In short, revolts, revolutions, rebellions, and resistors.
Before we delve into some history, let's define what the four terms just mentioned really mean in our context. A revolt is a sudden and short-lived act of resistance against slavery that consists of multiple people. A rebellion is a prolonged resistance to slavery that consists of multiple people but is unsuccessful. A revolution can be thought of as a successful rebellion, and a resistor is simply any person who resists slavery and cruel enslavers.
In 1619, the first slaves arrived in the United States, and their enslavers would be the white Christians in America. Slaves were practically forced to build the United States from the ground up by constructing countless structures such as railroads and houses, nurturing crops, partaking in grueling transportation, and following the every command of their slaveholders with brutal and even fatal consequences.
White slaveholders enjoyed holding an enormous amount of power over their African American slaves, and they also enjoyed the economic benefits of slavery. Because of this, slaveholders did not like the idea of setting their slaves free nor allowing them rights, even the most fundamental rights that all human beings should have.
How could slaves ever become free of these vicious slaveholders who were so selfish and cruel? The answer seems to be a change of mindset in the slaveholders that was influenced by a change of mindset in the slaves themselves. But how could these seemingly powerless slaves affect their powerful owners? Resistance.
The last line of the poem Harlem by American poet Langston Hughes reads, "Or does it explode?" when considering what happens to a dream deferred. Well, African American slaves were a people deferred without a real end to their bondage in sight, and after years of beatings, whippings, mutilations, and torture, they were about to explode.
The first known slave rebellion in the United States was the Servants' Plot, also known as Birkenhead's Rebellion. It took place in 1663 in Gloucester County, Virginia. This rebellion consisted of both African American and white indentured servants who fought against their enslavers who had been exploiting them to grow tobacco. This rebellion, by definition, failed and resulted in the 4 hangings of participants. John Birkenhead, the man who the rebellion is named after, was the reason it failed, as he betrayed his fellow servants and snitched to the governor. He was rewarded greatly for this in both money and freedom.
This event caused a shift in mindset of some indentured servants and slaves who realized that if they appeased their owners even at the expense of their fellow slaves, then they could be better off. Slaveholders gained power as they became more informed about how to control the allegiances of slaves. However, the new mindset of betrayal was not widespread among many slaves, as it was realized that the only way that they could put a complete end to their oppression was by working together.
This collaboration was seen in 1739 when the Stono Rebellion took place. 20 slaves organized a rebellion on the banks of the Stono River in South Carolina, recruiting more and more slaves to join. 44 enslaved African Americans were executed, and the effect of the rebellion was interestingly surprising, as it had the complete opposite effect as intended. It caused stricter slave codes. These codes were mainly made to discourage rebellions, and until the Haitian Revolution in 1791, the slave code seemingly worked.
The Haitian Rebellion was one of the biggest and most successful slave resistances in recorded history. It spanned from 1791 to 1804, taking place in what is now the sovereign state of Haiti. This revolution was led by Toussaint Louverture, and after his death was completed by Jean-Jacques Dessalines. Though Louverture and Dessalines had very different upbringings, a feeling of defiance festered in both of them as young adults, which they used in the Haitian Revolution. This revolution struck fear in the hearts of American slaveholders and inspired American slaves to resist.
In 1803, Igbo captives from what is now Nigeria were taken from their homeland to become slaves in America. And as you can imagine, the Igbos were quite unhappy, to say the least. 75 of the Igbo slaves took control of the ship, drowned their captors, and grounded the ship on the shores of Georgia in Dunbar Creek. After making it their way to the shore, the Igbos committed a mass suicide. The Igbos felt that death was liberty itself, and it was better than re-enslavement and living a lifetime of servitude. This act of rebellion presented the idea that individual autonomy and the preservation of it was more valuable to slaves than being alive whilst still enslaved.
Slaveholders were beginning to feel more and more pressured and more fearful. Speaking of inciting fear in slaveholders, remember the Haitian Revolution? Well, Its effects were about to be demonstrated in America 7 years after its conclusion. On January 8, 1811, in the east side of Mississippi in an area known as the German coast of Louisiana, a band of slaves killed their plantation owner and his son. This was known as the German Coast Uprising. Slaves stole and wore the slaveholders' military uniforms to tie their struggle to that of the Haitian Revolution. Similar to the Stono Rebellion, they began to march in aims to destabilize the institution of slavery. 95 people were killed.
Des Landes was a man who, although black and not free, still held power over other slaves, yet decided to work with them to fight against oppression. A mindset of resisting together was beginning to spread to an even greater degree than before, and slaveholders began to better understand the power slaves had when united.
One of the most daring rebellions began to arise with the aim to silence white supremacists for good. The Denmark Vesey's rebellion planned on seizing Charleston's arsenals and guardhouses, killing the governor, setting fire to the city, and killing every white man they saw. Their plan was leaked, though, from scared slaves beforehand and was never carried out. The rebellion leaders were arrested and tortured for information about the rebellion, but when they didn't break, all 36 leaders were hanged on July 2, 1822, including Denmark Vesey, who later on became a symbol for the abolitionist movement. This was a very symbolic rebellion, but not all were.
In 1859, John Brown, a white man, rebelled on a less symbolic note for the freedom of slaves. On October 16th, Brown and 21 slaves cut telegraph wires, captured Federal Armory and Arsenal, and rounded up hostages. Though the rebels succeeded, they were soon captured and Brown was tried. During Brown's trial, he spoke words of inspiration and catalyzed the writing of Frederick Douglass's book, Did John Brown Fail?, in which he praised his actions. John Brown said, "I had never had any design against the life of any person, nor any disposition to commit treason, or excite slaves to rebel, or make any general insurrection. I never encouraged any man to do so, but always discouraged any idea of that kind."
White Americans were beginning to understand the evil of slavery due to the rebellions. As Martin Luther King famously said, "Freedom is never voluntarily given by the oppressor. It must be demanded by the oppressed."
2 years after John Brown, the Civil War began. Slaves needed to fight for their freedom and resist, as the United States wouldn't have changed on its own. Freedom for slaves was largely due to the rebellions which caused Americans, mainly in the North, to realize the cruelness of slavery.
But it was also because, during and after the Civil War, the Northern Union government wanted to take away the power of the Southern Confederacy by freeing their slaves, which provided them with economic benefit and manpower. The first major attempt to end slavery occurred on January 1st, 1863, with the passing of the Emancipation Proclamation. However, this had a limited effect, so the 13th Amendment was ratified just over 2 years later on January 31st, 1865.
The future for African Americans after slavery seemed promising with the 13th Amendment, but many more troubles still laid ahead. Slaves were now free but unequal, as white Americans did not want to lose their power in society and kept a racial mindset. But African Americans had developed a mindset of defiance throughout their enslavement and participation in acts of resistance which allowed them to fight back.
In order to fight anti-racist ideas, the white supremacist groups incited violence towards black communities. This violence rapidly created a massacre known as the Red Summer from April to November, with 25 riots occurring.
Revolts, rebellions, protests, and movements occurred and arose and still do today, as seen by the Black Lives Matter movement. African American individuals are fighting for equality due to the lingering racist mindset of Americans today.
This lingering racist mindset can affect students' ability to learn about slavery and racism throughout history because racists can neglect to teach young adults the slave and anti-racist perspective. This can and will affect how young adults will view racism in our society, continuing racism for years to come.
Until this mindset is abolished, we must fight with revolts, rebellions, and revolutions for a true, equal America. We must be resistors.